Okay, so we're just going to give a couple of minutes for the participants to load up. Good afternoon, good morning, everybody. And they're loading up very quickly. That's great. And I'll probably just start. So, because there's a ton of people already on. Welcome, everybody. Welcome to my distinguished panel. I'm absolutely delighted to have all of you here. Thank you so much for being part of our delightful experiment, and all going well so far, and a lot of things to bounce off earlier on in the day, which I'll bring in towards the end, or I'll also make sure we touch. This panel is on corporate access and bringing interactions together, and I think I'd like to start just by inviting the panelists to introduce themselves and maybe just give us a few lines on how they felt that the corporate access market has adapted to the challenges of this COVID crisis. So perhaps, Doug, I could start with you and just tell us a little bit about you, who you work with and what you do, and a couple of lines on that topic.
Yeah, thanks, Mike. Doug Christensen, Executive Vice President at Tier1 Financial Solutions. We are a CRM company with workflows around corporate access, event management, and research for capital markets, banking, and investment management. I guess in terms of the question, I think while COVID was quite disruptive early on, a lot of events getting displaced in terms of physical attendance. I think through that first few weeks, a lot of them adapted to virtual meetings overnight. And if you look at the calendar going forward, just about every one of our clients on the sell side and buy side has gone virtual for the next foreseeable future. And we saw a lot of engagement in terms of needs to help support that. So I think that's been the challenge and the adaptation that we've seen in the market.
Fantastic. Mike, over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Mike. My name is Mike O'Connor. I run Citi's Global Access Strategies team. We're a team of 60 based in 13 cities around the world. How has the corporate access market adapted to COVID? I think overall very, very well. We were quite lucky in that 4 years ago, we started using virtual. We worked quite a lot heavily with Open Exchange, the video conferencing provider. So we were quite ready. I think last year we did something like 130,000 meetings, corporate access meetings, and 15% of them, 15 to 20% were virtual. So in March, we went 100% virtual, and we converted 25 conferences running up to June, through to June and July, and we've now converted the rest of the year globally to virtual. So it's been successful, and I think the street has performed quite well. However, the caution is that we've been running on adrenaline for the 12 weeks of lockdowns and work from home and stay at home. And now that adrenaline has worn off, that's where we now need to reassess the next steps.
Fantastic. Mark.
Yeah, thanks, Mike. Mark Pellegrino, the CEO of CorpAxe. Again, we are a fintech provider with a lot of solutions for the buy side around corporate access, workflows, resource tracking, broker votes, that sort of thing. I think, look, it wasn't a revolutionary change, as Mike points out. Some of this stuff's been going on. It's just scaled up to a degree that we've never seen before. And I think there's a lot of things that we'll probably get into in the course of the panel here that are still just kind of being dialed in, whether it's rate cards, whether it's format, whether it's the types of events people do, how analysts are involved, how they're not involved, and then what the buy side, as we've heard all day, they're just trying to get the resources they need to do the job, and video is just a medium with which everyone's kind of using right now. I think it was a little bit being shot out of a cannon in the March, April, May timeframe, as Mike alluded to. You got to move things quick. It'll be very interesting to see in the September timeframe when all the conferences come back what that behavior will be like, and I think that's going to tell you what the new normal will be for this period of time, at least until we get back into in person. So yeah, I mean, we've seen a lot of changes, but there's small tweaks here and there, which I'm sure we'll get into as we move forward here.
Great stuff. Vic, maybe I could hand on to you. Oh, actually, we can't hear you for some reason.
My bad, I was on mute. Apologies, I'll start again. Victoria Redgrave, Executive Director at Fidelity Investments, otherwise known as FMR. I've been on the corporate access team for over 12 years. We built our UK corporate access team back in 2012. We was one of the first in London. So what have we seen in light of COVID? So I'd say the first couple of weeks there was a lot of uncertainty for sure. You know, how's this going to work? How are we going to have access to corporates, etc., etc. Delighted to see that everything has worked like clockwork, really. I'd say there's been an uptick in interactions across the board with companies that we, you know, have a position with. Definitely an uptick in, you know, virtual conference attendance, which is great. I think the IR community has, you know, handled this brilliantly. I think, you know, everyone's kind of played their part, whether it's the buy side doing some of it themselves, you know, the sell side offering that we have. So far, so good. And, you know, I'm sure we'll see part of this, you know, continue in the future as we resume some kind of normality one day.
Excellent. Nicely handing on therefore to Lorna.
Thanks very much, Mike, and thank you for having me on this panel. My name's Lorna. I work at Credit Suisse in investor relations. I've been with the bank just over 20 years. 14 of that was doing corporate access on the sell side, and then I segued into investor relations to look after our investor engagement. The main takeaway for me for COVID is being flexible and adaptable quickly. And I think it's definitely provided us with an opportunity to continue what we need to do, back to Mark's point and back to some of the other discussions earlier, in a different format. We've tried everything: phone calls, Zoom calls, WebEx calls. We've done it all. We've also done it globally. And I would say at the beginning, there was a little bit of hesitation, both from our side, because it's something newer for us instead of our team typically going on the road. But as we've evolved through and we've done some conferences as well, it's becoming much more normal and people are becoming more comfortable with that format.
Excellent, good. Well, I can see the main problem that I'm worried about on this panel is that everybody's very nice and everyone's going to agree, unless I try and force some sort of friction into this. So the job for you guys is to respectfully disagree occasionally over the next few minutes. So let's see how that goes. Maybe we could just move on now. You know, it's very interesting to hear some of your comments on how this has all moved. It's actually quite a good story by the sound of it. But let's talk about conferences specifically, because COVID puts things into sharp relief sometimes. So it's just like this conference that we're doing today. There are some great things about having run this on Zoom and through the VFES platform, but there are also things that we're missing. So what have we learned about the value of conferences by this transition? Perhaps, Doug, maybe you could start us off, and I think I'd quite like to hear from everybody on this one, unless we labor it too far. So Doug, why don't you get us started? Yeah,
so I think, from the buy side's perspective, I think conferences are still highly valued. It's hard to achieve the kind of scale you want with what the sell side offers today. While we've seen and we're working with clients like Vic to help them originate conferences in-house, it's just difficult to get that much scale out of such large, platform type events. I remember, when I was on the sell side, we did, at least a dozen in the US, large, 180 to 200 companies. It takes a lot of effort. It's just hard to get that. And so I see, still value. It's how do you, place a number on it as you're, in a virtual world? Does it still have the same impact and value? I think it does. As Mark said earlier, it's just a different medium by which you're consuming it. And I think it actually makes it easier to do these events without having to travel, and it makes management much more accessible than if they were on the road with a limited schedule. So just some thoughts on that.
Yeah, very good. Vic, from your perspective, you gave us that picture just now, but what's good, what's worked well, and what do you miss? When you're valuing this stuff, can that translate?
Sure. Again, we've definitely seen an uptick in our investors attending conferences. In one respect, that could be that they have a lot more time on their hands. They're, at home, working from home, so they've got access to absolutely everything now. Pre kind of MiFID, there was a decline in our attendance. I don't think that was MiFID 2 driven. I think that was more of a case of our investors saying what's a must-have versus a nice-to-have. I think the sell side will continue to play a key part in corporate access, and I think to Doug's point, those conferences, where we get to see, there's a lot more than just kind of meeting corporates at a conference. There's the opportunity to meet with peers, meet with sell-side analysts. There's the opportunity to attend panels, fireside chats, et cetera. So, it definitely will still play a part in the future. I think, again, our investors really do look at what's a must-have versus a nice-to-have. So that would be why they've started to kind of draw back on attendance at conferences. And then to Doug's point, we have seen the buy side start to collaborate on joint conferences. From FMR's point, this is, another opportunity to see corporates. If we weren't involved in those conferences, that wouldn't affect our access. We have a global team. So I'm quite confident in that respect. So yeah, I think, for the most part, it's worked well. I think from FMR, the preference is audio over video. Just everyone gets a bit nervous before video goes live. Will it work? Are we going to have issues, et cetera, et cetera? So from our side, we've definitely had our PM say, can we have an audio? We don't want to go on so many Zooms, especially in a group format. But again, that works really well. So yeah.
Excellent. So, Mark, what's your perspective on this? Translating to the value of these conferences, these are things that are either being used as bargaining chips often in an overall all-in negotiation, if we're talking about the US, where corporate access is part of research, so quality matters and all those sorts of things. So what's your perspective?
Yeah, absolutely. I think maybe to kind of clarify some of the things we've heard across your panel today, everyone said the same thing, which is interactions are up, and they're right about that. But actually, events are down, and events are down materially. And we're in a unique position that we have everybody's events in one place, so we know that. And so when you think about events down but interactions up, the end result is more people, more touch points, and that's exactly what's happening. It's happening in conferences where there is no limit to the amount of people you can jam in a video call, and the quality just diminishes. And so what we hear across our client base is just huge degree of variability, particularly around conferences. And, call it the firms that are greedy and just threw everybody in, they're going to have a problem keeping clients attending these events. The firms that are selective and keeping things to a minimum and maintaining some level of intimacy in these meetings, I think are going to do a much better job. And as we think about our clients, they're trying to pay for those type of interactions and not pay where they just feel like they're one person in a giant video call, which is essentially a general attendance at a conference at that point. And so when you think about less events, more touch points, quality deteriorating, the end result, which we'll get more into, is clients saying, I'm A, not going to pay for this stuff, and B, I'm going to do some of this stuff myself. And so if the sell side doesn't find a way to really drive value through these events, you're just going to push people to kind of say, I can set up a Zoom call with a company directly and do that. So I think it's interesting, as we've heard so much about interactions today being up, the reality is there's less events out there and more people trying to get involved in them. That's why I think September will be interesting to see if, and it's a question for Mike, really, whether the street will make adjustments on this stuff to really dial it in, have better moderators, have better conversations, and really make these video calls a lot more worthwhile for their clients.
So great, thank you. So Mike, I think that's over to you. And obviously you're looking at this as well in the delivering of value and making sure that you're matching what people need and all those sorts of things. So maybe give us your stakeholder perspective on this.
Yeah, exactly as Mark said there is right. The interactions are up, but the events are down. Every conference we've converted to virtual has had more attendees, both on the corporate side and on the institutional side, and it's driven meetings and interactions. And that's part of that adrenaline that I spoke of, and let's throw this at the wall and see what sticks approach. But now we're talking to both corporate clients and investor clients about how we do get that intimacy in meetings. And for example, for a corporate, rather than just broadcasting to 200 people, you may as well just do that through your own website or constantly do webcasts. But what you really need to do is say, well, I need to now, for governance purposes, I need to talk to my top shareholders, and I need to do that in one-on-one format, and we need some two-on-ones and three-on-ones for new investors and like-minded investors. So we're looking now at the rest of the calendar to see how we can do that. If we have 4 slots with the corporate, the advice to investor relations in the corporate is, let's take 2 of those slots and keep them very, very, very intimate. 1 for a group of no more than 10, because you still want that interaction, and then you can have a 1 that's open to all, if you like, the kind of large group. And virtual gives you that flexibility. I think what's important is corporates are saying to us that they don't like audio only. They do want to see people on video now. So there's an expectation that the corporate broadcasts on video. Why can't they see the investors' faces and read the body language? So I think we're past that stage of just going for the quantity. And look, conferences remain a valuable platform for investor communication, governance, insight. But I think the future will be a mix of physical and virtual. Some conferences will go by the wayside. We do 130 a year. Now, when I took over, we did 70, and I was told to get that number down, and I've almost doubled it. I've gone the wrong way. It's so hard to retire conferences, but we've been retiring about 3 or 4 a year. The trouble is we've been adding 10 more. And I think those days have gone because the market is saturated. But the physical setup at conferences can be made more hygienic. Some travelers will choose to join virtually, but some will still want to come physically. For the global conferences that we do, virtual doesn't solve for time zones. So if you're an Asian investor and you wanted to attend our global tech conference in September, you can't do that now virtually unless you stay up in the middle of the night. Whereas actually traveling and being there, and okay, once you get over the jet lag, then the physical makes sense and becomes fruitful. So I think we will see a blend in 6 months' time, maybe longer, of physical and virtual. Physical is certainly not dead by any means.
Quick one. Can you explain why is it hard to retire an event? Specifically, are there just a number of factors that make it tricky because of the demand side and the fact that there's a bunch of people who just really want to come? But it's the question, is it Roger Waters playing the wall to the same gang that's slightly dwindling year on year, or how does it work?
Yeah, it's a mixture. So if you've got stakeholders, such as an analyst might be wedded to an event, and maybe they think of how the event used to be or whether it's part of their franchise. But sometimes you look at an event, and we try to do it with, say, a UK-only business services event that you'd say, well, it's small and niche and probably doesn't make sense. We should roll that budget into something bigger. But when you look at it, there's 40 top quality institutional investors attending. And the 15 corporates and CEOs and CFOs who attend say that's an efficient platform for us in London to go and see everybody in 2 days. And therefore, the arguments for retiring something like that then go away. So there's stakeholders who want to see these events, because ultimately a conference is an efficient platform for seeing a number of investors, and for an investor seeing a number of corporates over a given few days. So there is this creep, and if you look at I think there's something like 3,000 conferences, big industry conferences, sector conferences go on from Wall Street and the City and Asia and the like, and the calendar is just packed. When we try to move an oils conference by 2 days, and just couldn't, because we ran into 3 other conferences that were 2 days apart from the one that we had. So I think there will be some forced retirements of conferences that don't make sense. That has just been historically difficult to do.
Right, very good. So Lorna, so now from your perspective as the corporate, looking at the value of the efforts that you make, and then obviously this having gone virtual and turning into a more structured situation, what's your take on this? What have we learned in this process?
I mean, I guess I would say for me, my approach to how we've allocated meetings hasn't changed at all because it's virtual. So I very much have full sort of visibility on who we see and how we allocate those meetings. So back to Mark's point about the meetings being too big, we purposely kept them smaller for the same reasons that we would if we were in person. So that's the first thing. On the conferences, one of the benefits of being virtual is that we actually had two sections of time from our C-suite, which was helpful because we were able to cover the 2 time zones that we needed to cover our US investor base and our European investor base. So typically, if we went in person to a conference, we would only be there for 1 day, and we may have missed a certain top shareholder because they weren't there for that day. So those are the observations. We've done probably, in terms of our overall marketing, more roadshows than conferences, just because there are some that are flagship events and others that we just chose not to participate in. But I agree with everybody else, you know, the gathering of the people in the right place at the right time, nobody else can replicate. And I think it's about being flexible with your ideas in terms of how you present your management. So I see it that we're going to continue in that way, and I think we need to be open that if there are some investors who can't travel but they still want to engage with you, back to Mike's point, a hybrid model will exist going forward.
But Laura, is it not a nice thought if you're a senior executive who's been jet lagged half their life, and there's a sort of ESG benefit on not using the air miles so much, that isn't there a temptation to structurally turn quite a lot of this virtual and just do the ones that move the needle physically?
I mean, look, I'll be honest, as an example, we had a continental European city that we tried to arrange a day of meetings. The take-up was limited. If we had gone in person, we wouldn't have actually done that roadshow because there wasn't enough demand to justify the cost of the travel, the time, etc. We ended up with one good quality meeting, was very productive, and it was done virtually, which wouldn't have happened if we had stuck to our physical regime. So I think personally, I think there's certainly for IR-only meetings to some of the smaller locations where we don't get management to, and even being able to set up meetings with investors that are in obscure locations because it takes you so long to get there, then definitely virtual should be the way forward. And I think those investors are probably open to it because they're used to it, that they understand the challenges of getting somebody out to Des Moines, Iowa, or, you know, some obscure places that you have to get to, you know, from time to time.
Yeah. Obscure but beautiful and totally legitimate places. Absolutely. So very good. So perhaps now we can move to a topic that's come up a couple of times during the day, which is the buy side's move to do some of this by itself. Actually, you know, Lorna, while we've got you, maybe we start with you and then come back to the others. What's your take on this? There's obviously, you know, I don't know, have you seen that this move to virtual has created a more direct situation? I mean, it was kind of a trend anyway, but how have you reacted to that dynamic?
I would say overall, we had a pretty direct engagement process already in place. So I've been doing certainly a lot of our post-earnings meetings myself, contacting the investors directly. So I haven't personally seen a huge change just because of COVID.
Okay, very good. Vic, you're one of the gang of five, aren't you? So tell us about that.
Sure. So, speaking for FMI, I mean, we've always taken the direct approach, you know, and that kind of stems back to our analysts as well, not just the corporate access team globally, but, you know, we encourage our analysts to really own the relationships with their IRs and the companies they cover. So, you know, first couple of weeks into COVID, the analysts were all over it. They were the ones interacting with their companies, and I think that's a good thing. And I think, you know, across the board, we have seen a big build out of buy-side corporate access. I think it depends on the infrastructure of the firm. I think there's some firms that will consider doing that as we evolve, and some firms won't. And, you know, it just depends on the size of the company. It kind of goes back, if you flip that on the corporate side of things as well, the small mid-caps, you know, sometimes it's the CFO who's kind of, you know, the IR, if you like. So they've got those inbound requests coming from the buy side or whoever. if you're a larger company like Lorna, she's got quite a good team around her and she's able to kind of deal with these inbound requests. It's great, but not everyone's in that position. So I think we're going to continue to see, the buy side grow, and I think it's a good thing. In my mind, I think, as long as we get access, whether it be direct, whether it be, via the sell side, as long as we meet with the company, that's our main priority. And I echo what everyone's really said. I think there's going to be a dual model. There always has been. And again, in light of COVID, I'd say that, there's my buy-side peers are definitely thinking about new ideas and, how to interact even more with corporates, which I view as a good thing.
Excellent. So I'm really excited now because I'm hoping that we can have a proper disagreement. So Mike, I want to bring you in, and I'm assuming you're going to say this is rubbish. Let them try. The CFO that comes in from a certain market, expects a limousine, and et cetera, et cetera. And half the corporates need it. They prefer having the broker involved. Please give me some friction here.
It sounds like you've read my script there. Look. On one hand, I'm all for it. I've been trying to move to the buy side for years, and nobody will have me. So I believe in the vision. The direct model is growing, and it makes sense for the larger investors. But I think there's still a role to play for the sell side. For example, things like access to Africa and China. So one of the largest global investors, who's got a big established corporate access team in house, still use Citi for access for Africa trips, insight to China. And just this morning, they came to me and asked me to think about thematic access on topics like water scarcity. So I think the largest 20 investors have teams, and that's growing. But I think there's still 400, 500, 600 investors behind that who corporates want to engage with and should engage with for growing the shareholder base and for governance. And as Vic said, some corporates want to use the sell side for the efficiency angle from their point of view, etc. So I don't see it as a conflict. When you take the big six long only investors who have corporate access teams, they do a huge amount. When I look at the access that we provide to them, it's probably only come off about 15 or 20%. So again, I guess it's like the analyst model. If you hire an internal buy-side analyst, one of the first things they do is develop sell-side relationships to bounce ideas off. And I found that happen. Relationship in the amount I talk to Vic and the others at those big six has stayed the same. So it's not the lights are being switched off on one side and on the other, but there is that kind of growing trend. But it makes sense. I pitched to European corporates 18 years ago in Europe, and I remember then them saying to us, look, we talk to these investors direct. You don't need to try and get us access to these. So that's been going on for 18 years. It's not a new phenomenon. And it will continue to grow. And of my 60 people, I've had 3 people over the last 2 years have moved to the buy side to do corporate access there. So that will gradually happen. And I just don't think it will be a step change. I think it'll be fairly organic.
Excellent. Okay, very good. Doug, you got anything you want to add on this topic?
Yeah, I mean, just listening to everybody talk about, their views on it, I think it's the same debate that's been going on for many years, which is quality versus quantity, right? These large-scale conferences, if you're just providing one-on-ones, logistic presentations, not a thematic, idea wrapped in your research, with very driven by thought leadership, you're going to struggle to maintain your conference platform, which is why they would go direct if you're not adding value. And, I spent a lot of years, on the sell side creating these events that demonstrated value, whether it was autonomous driving or Internet of Things, or, and it had to be, structured so that the analysts wrote a very thematic piece. They got out and talked about it, and then they put their event around it. And that's where we started to see much more traction with interest from the buy side. And I think that still remains the same and will continue. And if you're not adding value, the the buy side will continue to go direct just to facilitate a conversation if there's no theme related to it.
Yeah, Mark, you had a couple of comments on this in pre-panel, both on the sell side, but also the virtual physical. When you need to see someone and when you don't. So maybe you can pass this on a little bit.
Yeah, sure. Look, I think the sell side has never fully realized the amount of direct engagement that's always existed. And it's one of the things that surprised me moving from the sell side to the buy side. And Lorna pointed it out. They've been talking to companies forever. Every time there was an earnings release, they set up a call with the company. And that's always happened. And that'll continue to happen. We're absolutely, and we're in a fortunate position. I think the vast majority of firms that have set up internal corporate access teams use our software and to help them coordinate across the sell side and direct. They're doing more direct, and it's part of what I hinted at before is if they don't feel like they can get these meetings in high quality from the street, they're going to try and do some of that on their own. But the flip side of that is that we talked about 5 last year, 5 this year. This hasn't been an explosion across the industry, and I think it's a huge missed opportunity for a lot of large asset managers. And I think senior people at these firms that do 2 things. When they look at their budget, they go, we can live without that. We've done fine up to this point. Or they talk to their PMs and the PM goes, I don't know, I'm getting everything I want. I don't really need that. You talk to a Vic or anyone in Vic's seat, you realize it can be done so much better. And that's not about disintermediating the sell side. It's about globally coordinating access to things that Mike's talking about, whether it's thematic, access to companies, getting teams to work together, building efficiencies. It's so much more than that. There's just so many firms. And Mike said the top 20, he's right. It's like 20 through 100 is kind of in, they're kind of just not innovating. They're in, their regular pattern they've been in for years. And it'll be interesting to see if those guys start to realize there is a better way to coordinate this stuff. And so COVID is driving that. I do think if you talk to most people, they'll say this has accelerated the trend in place. It's only been a few months. It's not like there's 50 new teams, but people are definitely having the conversation and starting to think about how to work that in.
Isn't it just difficult if you're not massive to try and do this stuff though? I mean, isn't this a preserve of the largest?
I don't necessarily agree with that. I mean, you could talk to Lorna. I mean, she's, she doesn't only talk to the, Fidelities of the world to pick on Vic. I mean, they're high quality shareholders that go all the way down the chain that you're going to have relationships with. And it's not about building a 15-person team. It's just about having somebody who can be proactive, because most investors, the number one thing, if you've sat around portfolio managers and analysts, they're the least proactive people in the world. They sit there and for years, they've just let stuff come into their inbox and they react to it. And so having people sit in a seat that can think for them, know what they care about, because frankly, the biggest gap is the sell side really knowing what their clients need at any given moment. It's a bigger gap than you'll ever realize until you move to the buy side. Having a team that knows, sits in the morning meeting, hears what themes come up, and can proactively go out and deliver those resources is a huge value add for buy-siders. And firms just haven't invested in it across the board. I think there's a long way to go here.
Excellent. Lorna, maybe you can help us a little bit, on this journey that you've been through, MiFID II and now COVID. I mean, how many things do you want to have go on? How have you felt the sell sides worked through COVID? How have you interacted with them? But also, talk to me a little about just the generals, the logistics and things. I'm getting a couple of questions coming through, people talking about why audio and all this sort of stuff. So can you just sort of set the scene for us a little bit?
Sure. I mean, I think, one of the things that wasn't mentioned, but it's more on Mike's point. I mean, for example, having relationships with Vic and her counterparts on the buy side for conferences where it's a sell side event is critical, because, if I get requests and I want to clarify that the right person is in the right meeting, we do sometimes fixed income and equity meetings at the same event. I need to double check that the individual is allocated to the right stream. So it's not just a case of setting up direct meetings, but there's also a huge part of clarifying, or you haven't seen the registration from somebody you thought was going to the conference. So maybe back to your point, Mark, they're bombarded with all the registration emails, they missed the one, they haven't done it, they're a late request, etc. So all of that is also quite crucial to ensure that at the end of the day, I deliver a good schedule to my management team for the day that they spend at a conference. So that's the first thing. The second thing is in terms of challenges, to your question. Yeah, I mean, there's a little bit of trepidation because it was something that we were unsure of, and people didn't want to. It was a difficult time as it was, just in terms of sort of making sure, you know, you could engage, and, you know, you're engaging with your shareholders, and you don't want to be hampered by any technology. But as that's evolved and people have become more comfortable with that, if I look back at what we were doing at the beginning of May versus the second week of June, it was night and day. And the more that people become comfortable with the Zoom or WebEx or whatever format works, it's also about establishing what works. And while investors are still working from home, they can access things, you know, not necessarily that they can in the office, et cetera, et cetera. So there's a lot of that's going on behind the scenes. For me personally, putting our team out on all these conferences and roadshows was a lot more work than putting them on a plane and sending them to a European city.
That's excellent. And you know, I echo some of these things about, you know, going on video. Obviously, I had to wipe all the secrets on the whiteboard, all the amazing insight that we have that we charge so much money for. So, you know, there are things that you've got to think about when you're doing these things. But Lorna, maybe just back to you for a second on the evolution of the IR role. I mean, you know, one of the things is obviously you have quite a specific role, and you've got an interesting career history that you can bring to bear in this role. I'm trying to gauge, you know, how common that is and whether there's a little evolution going on. And maybe Vic, you can sort of talk about that from your perspective as well.
Yeah, I think it does depend on the size of the company, but I definitely think that IR teams are realizing that they're having to do more themselves. And so does that responsibility lie with the IROs who are perhaps more technically focused and dealing with the numbers and sort of some of the more, the other element of IR, and then have a resource or it's shared amongst a smaller percentage to manage the requests? Because at the end of the day, you also don't want to have multiple touch points to your C-suite. You don't want to have duplications on meetings that, you know, we have a team in the US and they're booking a meeting with an investor, but I'm trying to book the same investor for a meeting in Zurich or vice versa. So I think it makes sense to centralize it. And obviously for us also, because we do both fixed income and equity, we've done hybrid roadshows where we've actually contacted a buy-side firm and asked them to include both asset classes in the same meeting, subject to their interest. So I think that trend will continue, and in what form and expertise. I mean, I can say from my own experience, understanding how a conference works and how the sell side operates made my job 100 times easier.
I can imagine. Very good. And maybe Vic, the corporate evolution from your perspective.
So I think, you know, Zoom came into play just at the right time for us all. I'm more Zoom meetings myself over the last 3 months than in my whole career. So obviously it has clearly played a part. And as everyone said, it will continue to play a part. I think, you know, from our side, it's kind of in our DNA as investors, right, to want to be able to go out and see a company at their headquarters, you know, see management beyond C-suite, et cetera, et cetera. So I think, you know, as and when they do so, we'll definitely see people wanting to kind of get back on a plane and go and visit a company at their headquarters or do a, you know, deep dive into a company. I think, you know, as a new analyst ramping up in the sector, I think they can certainly make use of kind of these virtual interactions. I think that kind of avoids them having to kind of hit the management teams with requests like that, so kind of the day-to-day. I think the conferences will continue to play a key part on the sell side and the buy side. I think we'll see more from the buy side on that. And, you know, NDRs, I think for the most part, just from the efficiency standpoint, if a company wants to use a broker to arrange their NDR, we definitely haven't got an issue with that. It's absolutely fine. You know, if it makes their life easier, and again, you know, if they don't have the infrastructure in place to facilitate it themselves, as long as we get to see the company, we're happy with that. However, if the company approaches us themselves or we approach a company, so it's really a mix, and I see that kind of going on. I think we'll probably, as we move into next year, there'll be a slightly different model, but I think it will still be that dual of the sell side, the buy side, and then also, that interaction directly.
Mike, can I add to that real quick?
Yes, please do.
Yeah, so one of the large trends you see in the U.S. is the sell side analysts moving over into the IR role, and I think what the result of that will be harder to get access to C-level management across the board, both for sell side events and for investors, and in particular hedge funds that maybe companies are more wary about seeing in some cases. And you have these analysts who come in and go, you know what, I talked to these guys for years. I do this for you. You stay home. You're exhausted. You're going to do the 1 or 2 big events a year. You're going to do the 1 or 2 big markets and the top shareholders, and that's it. I got everything else. So Lorna talked about prospecting in certain regions via video. They'll do that, or that IR person will go out and test that market before they bring management and have to qualify it. And so the end result of that is going to be harder access to the C-level management, and those investors that crave that are going to have to get on a plane and go to the management's office to see them. So I think once this thing clears over, you're going to see more field trips, more people having to get on a plane to get higher quality access. Again, the largest investors of the world are probably going to be fine. It's not going to be as hard for them. But when you think about the whole broad, ecosystem of investors, it's going to be hard, and management can't spend all day on the road. And so there's hundreds and hundreds of sell-side analysts that are now in IR seats that I personally worked with, and we could all name them. And that trend's just going to continue, I think.
So if I'm smaller, I'm going to be more jet lagged. So that's interesting.
Yep.
Doug, I just wanted to bring in, we've got a couple of questions. We've actually got a bunch of questions. I've got to choose a couple. But Doug, just bringing all this together, right? So you've got all the corporate access stuff going on. Then we've heard about all this stuff earlier on today about valuation processes and all that type of thing. How does it all work? I mean, what's your take on sort of joining this all up into a process? Because there's things like corporate access is research in the US and not in the UK, and et cetera, et cetera. So maybe help us on this.
Yeah, no, I think there is definitely a more efficient way to track the consumption and valuation of research going forward. And that to me is by providing the buy side with those tools to do it at the point of engagement. I think the industries over the years, the sell side has invested a lot of resources and time into building their own CRMs to capture their own interactions so that they can report them up in a way that they can be voted and paid for. And it's become mandatory, and if they want to get paid. But at the same time, there hasn't been a lot of investment in technology to provide the same tools to the buy side, and that's what we do. We're a CRM first and foremost, and it's just creating another persona for the buy side to capture what they consider valuable interactions at the point of engagement, to tag, track, and value it, instead of waiting for it at the end of the cycle, the quarter, and what they get is a lot of volume. Most of it needs to be reconciled, and it may not demonstrate the value, and so it's cumbersome. It takes time. So if we can, provide the right tools to the portfolio managers, in my mind, they can grab it, tag it at that point of engagement, and really change the dynamic of how they can value and consume things that they feel are value add without having to manage the administrative burden of that sell side, buy side consumption reporting piece.
Yeah, fantastic. I mean, Mark, obviously you came from the corporate access side, the DNA's from the corporate access, and then you're doing a lot more. So maybe take us through that a little bit before I come up with a couple of questions.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, I think Doug's onto it here. Once you start to have a certain percentage of your interactions direct anyway, that's not coming in through your consumption feed. And the reality is you want to see all that stuff together, whether it's because of compliance. And actually, we're hearing more from mostly hedge funds, where even folks like the SEC have come in and said, you got to have a record of what everybody's doing. And it's not good enough to just have a broker do that. So the consumption's important. It complements it. But if you've set up your own stuff and you don't have that in the database, you've got a hole in your ability to manage your compliance. So yeah, you've got to have everything together. You got to have it validated. You got to have it clean, and it's got to be the least amount of work possible. And you can't disrupt the investment process, right? I think, Steve Moreno said that on your last conference. do no harm to the investment process. That's the whole goal, is how can you make all this stuff happen behind the scenes so it's not a lot of work, so that the investors can just focus on their job and they can find the events no matter where they come from. So I think it all plays into that. I mean, look, there's just been so much talk today on interactions. You get really in the weeds on this stuff. It's really just about paying for the things of value and making sure investors can get what they need to do the job. And it's going to evolve. I mean, I think, these systems will continue to improve and will be highly automated, and who knows, maybe in 5 years, interactions isn't really what we're all talking about. Hopefully we're frankly not. But it is a pivotal part of how the business is conducted today. And you kind of need that, on both sides to have a real conversation around value and thus payment.
Excellent. So at this stage, we've got about 3 minutes, a couple of questions, and hopefully we can rattle through them reasonably quickly. Before I go on to those questions, just to everybody watching, absolutely delighted you've come along. There is going to be one of my more hopeful and ambitious team, one of the younger ones, has decided to put a link up in the networking area for a virtual drinks. I just like to say that we take no responsibility of the chaos that will ensue. And as far as I'm concerned, this event ends in 3 minutes. But you're very welcome to go into there. And I think he's just going to create a load of breakout rooms. I'm not even sure you'll know who's in there with you. But do come in, bring a beer. My drink's going to change color in 5 minutes. So just on that note, maybe we'll see you there. In terms of questions, we've had a bunch, so I can't get through all of them. What about conferences where virtual and in-person happen side by side? Is that something that people can envisage, that people would want? Maybe Mike, on the sell side, can you imagine events running where there's two elements going hand in hand?
Yes, definitely. I think we will be moving to that sooner rather than later. I think there is the need for the physical element, just for the interaction, the networking, the ability to do a deep dive. However, the finance departments of a lot of investors and corporates will be saying, look, the amount of money we've saved on T&E through the pandemic, you're not going to get that all that back. So your budget comes down. So you will get investors and to an extent corporates saying, look, I'd love to join your conference, but can we do it virtually? And I think time zone dependent, we will allow for that. In fact, we were doing that before anyway. We were having investors, continental European investors, wanting to dial into our East Coast conferences. And again, the efficiency for them was not having to get on a plane, not being jet lagged. And the way the time zones work, you can get 4 or 5 quality meetings in a day. So that was already happening, and I think it has to continue, and it will do. The future will be definitely. I think if we were 85% physical and 15% virtual before, we will come out of this and it will be 65% physical, 35%, or 60-40 physical to virtual. I think that's where it will settle.
Excellent. And final question to Vic. So we've had someone say, how much, I'm not asking for the exact number, but is there a difference and is it material of how much you're willing to pay for virtual events versus live ones?
Okay, so I'm not going to go into too much detail on kind of pricing and how we price that, just because we have that conversation with each and every one of our research providers. I would just say, there's still a value in virtual conferences, absolutely. I touched on this before, though. There is an element of, sometimes when we were going to these conferences in person, there was a slight different feel to what it is now, right? Because now it's just call after call after call. So there is a slight change there. It has shifted. I think, again, I'll just reiterate what I said earlier. Conferences will continue to play a key part. We welcome the conversation with any of our research providers have around pricing. But yeah, others may feel differently on that.
Yeah, okay. Anyone else on a differential between virtual versus physical? No, very good. So I think that's our time. And I'd like to finish this by just saying, I'm not sure if Vic's going to be on the Corporate Access panel next time we do this, whether it's physical or virtual, because she's been promoted. So congratulations to Vic. And we'll keep in touch and all the best. So on that rather positive note, you've all failed a little bit. There wasn't enough disagreement, but we did quite well. I thought we really explored some of those issues, and I hope that the audience agree with us. I'd like to thank everybody who's attended for the whole day. I'd like to thank the panelists on this panel. I thought it was absolutely fascinating. And hope to see some of you in the mad breakout rooms that are ensuing in the networking area. So thanks very much. Thank you, guys.